Eternal September refers to that period of time around the end of 1993 or the beginning of 1994 when internet service providers began offering Usenet access to the mainstream public. Prior to this, Usenet experienced an annual influx of new users every September, mainly from university freshmen. But this influx became constant when America Online, for example, began its Usenet gateway service in March of 1994. This constant stream of new users overwhelmed what was up until then the existing culture and norms of online forums, leading to a perceived and lamented decline in the quality of discussions, for example. The opening of the floodgates to the unwashed masses was really the genesis of what the average person considers to be the dawn of the internet age.
This podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as financial advice. All views expressed on this podcast are solely the opinions of the host and/or any guests that we might have from time to time. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as a specific inducement to make a particular investment or to follow a particular investing strategy.
Guten Tag, buenos dias, morgen, and welcome to episode 201 of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. Real quick, I would like to give a shout out to everyone who attended the Bitcoin meetup last night at the Melbourne Yacht Club in Melbourne, Florida. It was great to meet up with some new Bitcoiners I'd never met before, some local Bitcoiners I'd never met before. If you are listening to this podcast from Central Florida or the Space Coast of Florida, Brevard County, Cocoa Beach, Cape Canaveral, Melbourne, Palm Bay, Titusville, etc., and want to make sure you don't miss out on the next meetup, make sure you're following this podcast at BTC Bulletin Pod. That's at BTC Bulletin Pod on Twitter or X, and I'll make sure you're apprised of when the next meetup is. We don't currently have one scheduled yet that I know about, but I have some ideas about where to host the next one, and so hopefully I'll be involved in putting that together, and I'll relay that information to you. It would be really cool to meet up with some of our listeners, to some of you that are listening to this podcast in person. That would be absolutely thrilling for me. Speaking of out and about in Florida, I spent a good portion of the day in Orlando taking care of business for my fiat bias business. I'm having a hard time talking again tonight. It's because it's been a really, really long day. I forget what it was, but there was this where I first heard it. There was this philosophy that says that the average human has 10,000 words or whatever that they can say in a day, and that when you've used up that number of words, that you're just done, and that you can't spit anything else out for the rest of the day till you go to sleep and reset. And I'm certainly feeling like that right now. So I do apologize in advance if I'm a little more scattered brain than usual, but I was really busy rounding up some loose ends, some dotting some I's, crossing some T's for my fiat mining operations. And so once again, I'm running a little bit short on time after a very long day, but we do have some really cool, really interesting things to speak about. Last week, we spoke about how this cycle felt to me a lot like the 2016 halving cycle, and that I went over the ways that January of 2025 really reminded me in a lot of ways of January of 2027, and that if those similarities continue to happen, if this cycle were to repeat or at least rhyme with what happened in 2017 during the 2016 halving cycle, that you ain't seen nothing yet. In fact, if we just rhyme with any of the halving cycles, we really don't expect the bull run to get rip roaring until summer, late summer, early fall. For example, as I mentioned in the last several episodes, the previous all-time high before the ETF pump happened in November of 2021. And the 2017 all-time high happened in December of 2017. Traditionally, we really don't get ripping and roaring until, August, September, October, November of the year after the halving. So if that is even remotely close to what we experience, this cycle, unless something really black swan or golden swan happens, I fully don't expect this bull run to even really have gotten started yet, even though we're right around $100,000 per Bitcoin, which would have been unbelievable this time 4 years ago to many, many people. I know there's a lot of people that are still in denial about that, especially in the gold bug world. But once again, I digress. We do have a lot to talk about. Also, I do want to mention that in addition to rhyming a lot with 2017, I think that where we are in Bitcoin adoption, it really reminds me of what I spoke about in the introduction, the eternal spring, that, the internet, the bare bones of the internet, the basics of the internet were around for decades before AOL and CompuServe and Netscape brought internet to the mainstream public, to the unwashed masses, to the general public. But despite the fact that internet had been around for more than 10 years, we really, if you got one of those AOL discs in the mail, I guess at first you had to like buy an AOL disc, and then they started handing them out for free at grocery stores and stuff. And then they started mailing it to you. You get like 2 or 3 of them a month in your mailbox. Just throw away CDs or throw away floppy disks with the software to run AOL on it. Because at the time it used to be expensive. You'd pay like per minute to use the internet. I think AOL, the AOL subscription came with maybe 30 minutes or 60 minutes of internet time. And after that, you paid a couple dollars a minute just to be on the internet. It was nuts. But despite the fact that internet had been around for like almost 20 years at that point in time, the people that were using AOL and CompuServe in the mid to late 1990s were still very much early adopters, right? I mean, if you were using internet in 2001, you're considered an OG. And I think that's kind of the same thing with where we are at this stage in Bitcoin. Bitcoin's had several really good rallies post-halving, especially the last 3 halving cycles. It's gone mainstream as far as the media is concerned. The Bitcoin price is on, newspapers and every mainstream financial ticker. Most of the people have heard about Bitcoin, even if they can't give you a really good rundown of what exactly Bitcoin is. But still, there's maybe only a couple million people that are actual Bitcoin users. Maybe people have Bitcoin exposure now in their retirement funds or their portfolio, or someone talked them into buying, the Bitcoin ETF or MicroStrategy stock to get indirect exposure to Bitcoin. But the actual number of people using Bitcoin, not even people trying to use it as their daily driver to be on a Bitcoin standard, as in, with a peer-to-peer electronic cash that Satoshi Nakamoto wrote about, but people with any direct exposure to Bitcoin, as in whether not just people who have it in a hardware wallet somewhere, but anyone who's even bought Bitcoin, whether they keep it on Coinbase or Robinhood or whatever. We're talking about millions of people out of billions of people in the entire world. Let's say there are 10 million Bitcoin users, and I don't think it's anywhere even close to that. But if there are 10 billion Bitcoin users, we would have to 10 million. We'd have to get 10x just to get to 100 million. We'd have to 10x again to get to 1 billion. And then we'd have to 3x that before we're talking everybody in the world using Bitcoin. So much like the fact that there were people that were paying for AOL subscriptions and dialing up and checking their email and maybe creating a MySpace page, etc. back in the 1990s, it was still a very, very small percentage of the world. I mean, there's still a relatively very small percentage of the world that's fully connected to the internet at all time. I mean, I know that's a lot more widespread than it was just 5 or 10 years ago, but certainly way more widespread than it was in the 1990s. And that's the point I'm trying to make, that if you're a Bitcoiner now, if you have a couple of Satoshis and you have them in your own self-custody in a hardware wallet somewhere, you are like those first AOL users that were popping that free CD into their computer and checking out what this thing called internet was back in the earlier mid 1990s. So they say we're still early to Bitcoin, and we are in so many ways. But before we get into that and take a look at the news, I do want to run down our customary look at Bitcoin's vital statistics. At the time of this recording, we are sitting at a block height of 882,480, and Bitcoin is ringing in at what some people consider a depressing 96,750 US dollars. That is $8,000 cheaper than Bitcoin was last DCA Wednesday, but still, about where it was. I mean, you don't even have to go back to a month ago before we were stacking at $95,000. So it's kind of funny that Bitcoin's one of those things where the minute Bitcoin sets a new all-time high, then everybody mentally, that's just where Bitcoin should be. And if it's anything below that, it's just horrifically disappointing to the average normie mindset. When if you just step back, if you had been hit by a train and you were in the hospital in a coma just since Thanksgiving, and someone told you that Bitcoin was ringing in at 96,750, they'd say, oh, well, that's doing pretty good. That's, just a couple $100 more than it was right before I get hit by a train. So awesome. We haven't had a pullback or a retracement, when in reality, we've zoomed above 100,000 US dollars multiple times and then had these little pullbacks. Bitcoin's price of 96,750 US dollars per Bitcoin, to me, means that this is going to be the first stack in a couple of weeks where we're going to get more than 1,000 Satoshis for every fiat dollar we convert into Bitcoin. Last week, it was the second week in a row that we got less than 1,000 sats per dollar. This week, we're hopefully, if Bitcoin doesn't shoot through the roof while I'm yammering, we will get 1,034 sats for every fiat piece of paper that we convert to Bitcoin, and that makes me happy. I know there's been a lot of going back and forth on Bitcoin Twitter, for example. I posted something on my personal Twitter account about how I was happy the price was down because, regardless of how much Bitcoin you have, you always feel like you don't have enough. And regardless of how much you have, even if you can really deep down inside say, I've stacked as hard as I could have, even though you stacked as hard as you could have in the past, that doesn't mean you're done stacking. You want to continue stacking. And if you're looking at the price of Bitcoin running to 200,000 or 300,000, all of a sudden we're talking maybe 500 or 250 Satoshis per dollar. And it's going to make it a lot harder to achieve the number of Satoshis that you might have set as your next stacking goal. You have some of they're wannabe OGs that have been around. This is like either their first or second halving, and they're patting themselves on the back for how OG they are. And like, you must not have stacked hard enough. That just shows, what a noob you are. And I had someone call me out. It's like, your profile's only been around since 2020. Clearly you don't have enough. You're just a whiner. I'm like, okay, well, whatever, brother, because I've been around a lot longer than 2022 or 2021, whenever I created 2021, I guess, when I created the Twitter handle to go along with this podcast. But even if I hadn't, even if this is your first episode that you're listening to, or whether you started stacking before Andreas Antonopoulos, nobody ever feels like they have enough Bitcoin. Maybe Satoshi Nakamoto might feel like he has enough Bitcoin, but only because he is such, he was such a generous individual or organization that when he created Bitcoin and released it to the wild and wanted to spread that Bitcoin around. In fact, Satoshi even stopped mining. He would turn his miner off, he would turn Bitcoin Core off to give other people a chance to mine blocks, and would only start mining again when the hash rate was slowing down a bit or wasn't growing as fast as he anticipated. The point being, none of us have enough Bitcoin. Do we have enough Bitcoin to put us in the global elite one day when the average normie in whatever corner of the world they're listening to this podcast from is desperately scratching and saving and trying to stack as many Satoshis as he can, trying to get that 100, maybe 200,000 Satoshi stack? Do we have more than that? Hopefully you do. If you've been stacking alongside this podcast, you have significantly more than that. But for the most part, unless you are Satoshi Nakamoto or some really OG whale, I mean, even Michael Saylor doesn't feel like he has enough Bitcoin, right? I mean, he wants to have all of it. I'm not going to go full on Scrooge McDuck and say never enough, because, if I had all 21 million Bitcoin in my own personal hardware wallet, it would become useless, right? Because who are you going to trade Bitcoin with for goods and services if there's no other Bitcoiners out there, if you're hoarding it all? But I'm getting a little bit of a tangent right here. The point being, I am happy to see that Bitcoin is under 100,000 US dollars, because that means we're going to get 1,000 or 2 extra Satoshis when we do our stack here in a little bit that we wouldn't have gotten if Bitcoin was still 104,000 US dollars per Bitcoin like it was last DCA Wednesday. And you will have plenty of time, mark my words, to savor the fiat value of your stack, if that's what's truly important to you, in the coming months, because $104,000 per Bitcoin is nothing, I believe, compared to what we're going to see before this halving cycle comes to a close and we roll on towards the next halving, and it all begins again, as the song goes. And certainly if you zoom out beyond the next year or two, and you're talking 4 years, 10 years, if you're in your 20s, maybe you're talking 30 years before you retire, because not everybody just wants to sit in a rocking chair and sip lemonade or sit on a tropical beach somewhere. Sure, that sounds really cool, but most of us have a passion in life that we want to do. Hopefully, if you have a fiat mining job, it's doing something that you're interested in, at least something that you want to participate in. Or maybe you hate your job And, Bitcoin pumping through the roof would allow you to tell your boss to F off, and then you go do some other fiat mining job just to give your life some meaning, to feel like you're contributing to your community or society. But again, I'm getting way off track. Continuing on with the vital statistics, Bitcoin's current price means its market capitalization is just a smidge under that $2 trillion mark, currently ringing in at 1.92 trillion US dollars, still incredibly respectable. Definitely not just a tulip bubble or baseball card level of investment, with a market cap of just under 2 trillion US dollars. For those of you who continue to value wealth in shiny yellow rocks, it will cost you 33.5 ounces of gold to purchase just one Bitcoin, more than 2 pounds of gold of the shiny yellow coins, Peter Schiffbucks, to purchase just one Bitcoin. I am running very basic noise canceling on my mic in here because, I'm in a nice studio. I've got a little bit of foam on the walls, etc., but noise still gets in. For example, something very, very large just flew over. With Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral just a stone's throw from the studio, sometimes these just massive transports come in to deliver satellites or rocket parts. And clearly, something along those sides either went into Patrick Space Force Base or to the south of me, or Cape Canaveral skid strip to the north of me. It was really cool back before the Antonov got destroyed in the conflict in Eastern Europe, because that at the time was the world's largest airplane as far as payload capacity goes. And it would fly in here from time to time when stuff that wouldn't even fit on the military's C-5 Galaxies needed to come into one of the space centers, one of the Space Force bases, and something very large went over. So it sounded really cool. I got a good back massage. It was vibrating the back of my seat. So I don't think I could hear it in my headphones. I don't know if it just didn't bleed through the noise canceling, or if it was so loud in person that I couldn't. But if you heard a loud rumbling noise, that was your tax dollars at work. God bless America, right? All right. For those of you who value your wealth in pizza, one Bitcoin will currently purchase you 5,411 large pepperoni pizzas from Papa John's. That is one pizza a day, every day, for just under 15 years. A staggering amount of pizza for just one Bitcoin. And moving along to that metric that has been my favorite metric for most of this podcast, Bitcoin's 24-hour average transaction rate is humming right along at what, up until all the spam was bloating the blockchain, would have been considered a very respectable 4.55 transactions per second. That is doing quite well, especially considering we have seen the mempools clear out, and that's normally indicative of a lack, a decrease in transaction volume. So we did obviously have a decrease in transactions being added to the mempool, but not so much that we don't have in the last cycle, I said every time we saw above pi, 3.14 transactions per second, that was indicative of healthy on-chain adoption. And since then, so many things have happened. We've got Lightning has become mainstream. There's other second layer solutions being developed. A whole boatload of normies are just buying and holding their Bitcoin in Coinbase or whatever, and that never touches on-chain as far as being written to the blockchain. It's just held in those big custodians wallets. It's not your keys, not your coins. If you're buying an ETF, then when BlackRock buys Bitcoin to back their ETFs, they're buying in big chunks. So even if they buy $500 million of the Bitcoin, that may be one or two transactions is all on the blockchain. So more than 4.5 transactions every second. That's pretty healthy on-chain activity. And, when we do see hyper-Bitcoinization, I've said this time and time again, I think you're going to see that 10 years from now, maybe even sooner, you and I, the average normie, are not going to be transacting on-chain. Maybe it's Lightning, maybe it's something else, maybe whatever comes along and replaces Twitter. Elon wants that to be the everything app. It'll be a lot more like WeChat or whatever in China, where it's your one-stop everything. It's your banking app, your social media app, whatever. If something like that comes along, or X morphs into something like that, and they build Bitcoin services into their network, and that automatically uses Lightning or some other second layer solution, whether or not you even know it. I think that it would be very easy to see that only whales moving large amounts of Bitcoin and governments and banks, institutions that are moving billions or hundreds of millions of dollars, at least of Bitcoin around, are going to be, they're going to be using on-chain, and the rest of us are going to be using some sort of second layer solution. So it could be we get to the point of hyper Bitcoinization, and there might only be 1 or 2 transactions per second. I mean, if you think about it, if all the countries and all the banks in the world are only just occasionally settling with other banks, with other countries on chain, I mean, there might be empty blocks, like a whole day worth of empty blocks with no transactions in them at all, but yet we still have hyper Bitcoinization where Bitcoin is the global reserve currency. So it's a fun metric to look at. And right now I like to see, around 4.5 transactions per second to indicate that people are really still using Bitcoin. But I expect that metric to become completely irrelevant in the not too distant future as we use second, even third or fourth layer solutions. I mean, you don't know what you don't know. It's truly impossible to envision where we're going to go. I mean, if you look at any of the sci-fi movies from the 60s, 70s, 80s, even the 90s, and what it shows the future looking like is just comic, right? Because, they take the progression of technology linearly out from where they're sitting right now, and they can't think of these huge leaps where the technology you have that you discover branches off in some completely unforeseen direction, and you like I said, you can't know what you don't know. So who knows where we're going to be? I certainly don't. All I know is that Bitcoin will play a more important role in our daily lives, whether we're using it on-chain or off-chain, or on-chain or on second layer solutions. But again, I anticipate that we're going to be using a second or third layer solution in less than 10 years. The other saying is people tend to overestimate what you can do in a year and underestimate what you could do in 10 years. So I'm saying 10 years. Whereas a cycle ago, it felt like everyone was going to be using Lightning within 1 year. And of course it took, years to get where we are with Lightning instead. But 10 years ago, nobody could have even envisioned Lightning. Even more than 10 years ago, when people first started kicking around the idea that spawned into the block size wars. Another big tangent that's not on my notes. Speaking of on-chain activity, the mempool cleared out for the first time in quite a while in between episodes. I know I had mentioned last week that it looked like it was clearing, and it has since. There's currently a little more than 3 blocks worth of transactions pending in both the mempools that I'm looking at. Clark Moody's dashboard is showing 6,801 transactions in his mempool, down from more than 43,000 transactions last Wednesday. Mempool.space also has 6,800. They have 6,824 transactions in their mempool, down from 50,000 transactions last DCA Wednesday. So a significant clearing trend. Again, that doesn't mean that on-chain transactions just came to a halt in the last 2 weeks. Those mempools have been bloated for like a year with Taproot Wizard shenanigans mostly. And a lot of that, when the price of Bitcoin through the roof, some of it just fizzled because it was a fad. Fads like S-Coins fizzle on their own. Some of it probably got priced out because if you want to mint a new BRC20 token on top of Bitcoin, your fees were pennies compared to what they were when Bitcoin went from, say, 15,000 a Bitcoin to 105,000 a Bitcoin. Nonetheless, Bitcoin's mempool did clear out over the weekend, and Marty Bent and Matt Odell on Rabbit Hole Recap had that running bet where Matt Odell bet Marty that the mempools would never clear again. Marty bet that they would, and Marty hands down won that bet. If you do need to send an on-chain transaction, it's still dirt cheap to do so. Clark Moody's mempool fee estimator is saying that an on-chain transaction, a high priority on-chain transaction, should include a fee of 3 sats per VByte, up from 2 sats per VByte last Wednesday. But his fee estimator is saying that if you have up to a day to wait, that a 1 sat per VByte transaction will be mined within a day. Looking at the last couple of blocks, most of them included plenty of transactions with just 1 sat per VByte fee. Mempool.space's fee estimator is saying that a 2 sat per VByte fee across the board should be included with any transaction, whether it's a high priority transaction that needs to be mined in the next block, or whether you don't care if you're just consolidating Bitcoin UTXOs and normally wouldn't bother you if it took a few days for that transaction to confirm. They're still saying any transaction right now should include a fee of 2 sats per VByte. At the current price of Bitcoin, that works out to just 27 cents. We haven't seen it that cheap in quite a while. It was 29 cents US dollar equivalent last week. Before that, it was $1.01. It's been kind of all over the place as the price of Bitcoin has fluctuated above and below 100,000, and as it also changes depending on how fast blocks have been coming in, because again, blocks on average are supposed to come in once every 10 minutes, but I'm looking back and I see 2 blocks that came in within a minute of each other. And then there's a couple of times when it was 15, 20, 30 minutes in between blocks. And so when you get to a point where blocks are coming in on a regular basis in the 10-minute time frame, there's a whole boatload of them that are including just 1 sat per VByte fees. And then when you get to where it's been drug out to about a half an hour, the blocks kind of stall out for a bit and it's a half an hour between blocks. There's some where the lowest fee is 3, 4, 5 sats per VByte. So if you are going to do a priority on-chain transaction, make sure you get a snapshot of what the fee estimators are saying at that time. If you're letting your wallet choose your fee for you, most likely it's going to overpay dramatically. So hopefully you're using a wallet that lets you set your fee, or at least set your fee range. But make sure you know what you're doing before you send a transaction, because you don't want to end up with a transaction that gets stuck in the mempool forever and not confirmed. If you do lowball it and things get busier than they had all of a sudden, or blocks slow down unexpectedly. We are now about 527 blocks away from the next mining difficulty adjustment. We spoke about those 10-minute block times. The Bitcoin protocol adjusts the difficulty that it takes for miners to find the next Bitcoin block every 2016 blocks, with the goal of keeping those blocks coming in at an average time of 10 minutes between blocks. When they're coming in too fast, it gets more difficult to mine Bitcoin. To slow things down, if they're coming in too slow, the difficulty's relaxed a little bit to help speed those blocks up and bring them down to 10-minute average block times. But because it is an average, like I said, sometimes blocks come in once every half an hour and sometimes 2 come in within a 1-minute span. That's why Satoshi said we were going to look at an average of 2016 blocks to determine what that average time is, instead of just rapid fire adjusting that difficulty on the fly, like some of those altcoin chains did. Currently, it looks like we're going to have another significant increase in the difficulty that it takes to mine the next block. The previous adjustment was a slight downward adjustment of 2.1%. That happened almost 2 weeks ago now. So now in about 3 days, we're looking at giving all of that up. Depending on where you get your data, it's going to be an increase of either 2.27%, which would be just a little more than the decrease, making up just a little more difficulty than the difficulty that was relaxed last adjustment, or potentially as high as 4.4%. Again, we don't know what the difficulty adjustment's going to be until it happens, because those last 527 blocks could just come shotgunning in rapid fire, or a few of them could take an hour. And so we won't know until we know. And again, this is only super important if you're a miner, because it affects your profitability. But if you're an average pleb, whether the block that your transaction is mined in comes in 2 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, or 2 hours, that's really up to random chance and what fee rate you set. So it doesn't necessarily have as much to do with the difficulty in the grand scheme of things anyway. The reason we're looking at a potentially 4.4% increase in Bitcoin's difficulty is because in the last difficulty epoch, blocks have been averaging 9 minutes and 34 seconds between blocks, even faster than last week when they were zooming in at 9 minutes and 36 seconds on average. So because that's faster than 10 minutes, the software would make it a little bit harder to mine Bitcoin to try and slow it down, 26 seconds to bring that out to an average of 10 minutes. Currently, there's an estimated 771.8 exahash of computer power securing the network. That is up more than 5 exahash from last DCA Wednesday. So just like the price of Bitcoin goes up and to the right, the amount of computer power securing the Bitcoin network has been going up and to the right, which is why in general, we've been seeing those difficulty increases, and why you need banks and banks of specialized mining computers, mining rigs, ASICs, to mine Bitcoin, because there's just so much competition computing power wise to mine the next block and score that miner reward for doing so. And even just scrolling through my notes, I mean, you only have to go back to last fall, and we were around 628 exahashes. So more than a 120 exahash increase just in the last couple of months, which is just astounding when you consider how much computing power that really is. Before we get on with the news, I want to take a minute to thank those of you listening on your favorite Podcasting 2.0 apps, such as Fountain. Podcasting 2.0 allows you to support this podcast through the value for value method by either streaming sats on a minute-by-minute basis as you listen, or by sending a boost, which is a shout-out via a Lightning transaction, where you can let me know what you think about the podcast, let me know what's going on in your community, or even just say hi, or say whatever you want, really. But because it's a Lightning transaction, you're sending value back in the form of Satoshis. That value is up to you. If you want to stream sats, you decide what it's worth to you to be listening to this podcast. If that's 1 Satoshi a minute, you can set it and forget it and stream 1 Satoshi per minute to this podcast automatically as you listen. If you think you're getting 10 sats per minute worth of value, you can choose 10 sats per minute. Again, that's a you do you thing. Shoutouts tend to be more popular. Boosts tend to be more popular. Boosts are basically shoutouts. I prefer boosts because they are a message. You get to say something, a message that I get to read on the next Bitcoin Bulletin podcast, and it's just more fun. And again, that's an amount that you set as well. You determine what you want to contribute back to this podcast and set it, boost it, and that's a one-time deal. We don't have any boosts to read this week, but when we do receive boosts, we read them on the next forthcoming episode. So thank you to those of you who have contributed back to this podcast and who continue to do so. And thank you to all of you who are listening, regardless of where you're listening from, regardless of whether you're listening on a Podcasting 2.0 app or whether you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or however you're listening. If you are not listening on Podcasting 2.0, and even if you don't have the means or the desire to contribute value back, I still recommend you download Fountain and listen on Fountain, because you can also earn Satoshis for listening to podcasts. They have sponsored content where you earn whatever 20, 30 sats for listening to a podcast. And then randomly they select a certain amount of Satoshis that they stream to you for the first hour or so that you listen to podcasts, depending on the day. And I think they have sponsors that sponsor that now. So subject to change, but the long and the short of it is you're not going to get rich listening to podcasts on Fountain, but you are going to potentially earn 20, 30, 100, 200 Satoshis that you can squirrel away and help build that stack of sats, or you can pass them along to whatever podcast you're listening to and contribute value back without actually draining your stack to do so. Speaking of our listeners, our geographic distributional listeners has remained kind of ossified. It tends to do that. We go months and months and months with no change in where you were listening from, and then we get big changes like we did last fall when Singapore burst onto the scene out of nowhere, really, because they weren't anywhere near the top 10 in listenership and rocketed all the way to the number 2 position. Currently this week, the top 10 countries for listenership remain as follows. Number 1 is the United States, where a little over 50% are you listening. So thank you to my fellow Americans listening right here in the United States of America. As I mentioned, number 2 remains Singapore. Just completely mind-blowing that they went from off the charts to the number 2 country by listenership. Very humbling. So thank you to those of you listening in Singapore. Apa kabar? Number 3 remains Germany. So Dankeschön, mein Freunds in Deutschland. Number 4 remains Argentina. So muchos gracias, amigos, in Argentina. Number 5 remains Luxembourg. So Dankeschön, mein Freunds in Luxembourg. Morgen to those of you who speak Luxembourgish. Number 6 remains Canada. So hello to those of you up north. Terribly sorry about the tariff kerfuffle. I think there's a lot of things going to be happening in the next couple of years, but regardless of what's happening on the day-to-day basis, nothing is going to change that really special relationship between the United States and Canada. So thank you to all of our friends listening from north of the border in Canada. Number 7 remains the United Kingdom. So our cousins across the pond in the UK, thank you so much for continuing to listen to numbers that keep you at the number 7 spot in our top 10. Number 8 remains Spain. So hola, muchas gracias, amigos, in Spain. Number 9 remains Australia, a distant second cousin from the United States. So Hello, thank you for those of you listening down under. And number 10, rounding out the top 10, remains Mexico. So hola, muchos gracias, amigos in Mexico. And again, thank you so much to every single one of you listening, regardless of where you're listening to. If your country is not in the top 10, it does not take a whole lot of additional listeners to bump some of these countries out of 11, 12, 13, 14 into the top 10. If you have a friend or family member that you turn on to this podcast, or a couple friends or family members, maybe go back and listen to a few older podcasts if you're a new listener just listening for the first time, and maybe you can boost your country into the top 10. But it is really flattering to know that we have listeners all over the world. I mean, I say it's flattering. That is a massive understatement. It is straight up humbling that I'm not just talking to Bitcoiners in Florida, in Kelco Beach or Cape Canaveral, or even just in the United States, that you sitting there listening to the sound of my voice somewhere that's might even be on a different day than today if you're across the international date line, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of miles away. It's really cool that you're taking your precious time, which is the most precious thing you have, and you're listening to the sound of my voice. And hopefully we're both learning about Bitcoin as we do. And that's what makes Bitcoin so precious, is Bitcoin is a store of human life. It is a store of your time. So when you're contributing value back to this podcast in the form of your time, not talking about streaming sats and value for value, supporting the podcast financially, I'm talking about contributing your time, the most valuable thing you have to joining into this podcast and helping make this podcast what it is. I can't even describe how humbling it is to look at the statistics and know you're out there, and that's really cool. So thank you wherever you're listening from the bottom of my heart. On to the news. As usual, it seems like the news is the price and the price is the news. We've let off with the price news almost every single episode. I think last week or the week before was the first time in months we deviated from that. What I want to point out about the price, because I don't usually like to dwell upon the price other than the fact that it determines how many Satoshis we're going to be able to stack, is that once again, remember I said that I feel like we're in 2017, like the spring of 2017, the late winter of 2017. And in January, the end of January, the beginning of February of 2017, we had a big pullback. Now, remember, I say that every Bitcoin halving bull run, every halving cycle has had 5 to 7 better than 30% pullbacks, even during the epic phase, the latter phases of the bull run, where it's just ripping. Where in 2017, where it went from 4,000 a Bitcoin to 20,000 a Bitcoin in like 2 months. Even during that period of time, we had a couple of we had a 36% and a 29% retracement. And ironically, we had a 38% pullback at the end of January 2017. Now, one of the pieces of FUD that I haven't spoken about a whole lot, because I quite frankly hadn't heard anyone mention it, was that every single year prior to this halving cycle, every time this year, you would hear China FUD. And well, in the old school FUD, it was China FUD. All the older days, it was China FUD all the time. China's banning Bitcoin. China's unbanning Bitcoin. China's banning Bitcoin again. I think they banned Bitcoin like 16 times. Then we had the big China miner ban. But one of the other big FUDs was the Chinese New Year, the Lunar New Year FUD, because for most of America and a lot of Europe, you know that Christmas is a big deal. Even if you don't celebrate Christmas, you know that everything around you is different at Christmas. All the shops are busier. It's just people are spending a ton of money. There's parties, family getting together from around the world even. And in other parts of the world, the Lunar New Year takes on equal significance. For example, the China FUD around the Lunar New Year was that I did business with China on multiple occasions, and I had some equipment that was manufactured for the company that I'm involved with that was shipped here directly from the manufacturer in China. And we had a custom snag because, we had to wire money because Bitcoin didn't exist yet, and they weren't taking Bitcoin. Even it did probably, maybe, I don't think you could do international business. You certainly couldn't do international business with Bitcoin in 2008 when I made this first purchase, because Bitcoin didn't even exist yet. So we had to wire money, and I think it took 14 days for my wire transfer to settle in the Chinese bank and for the manufacturer to be able to confirm they had it. And during that time, they were getting worried because the big Lunar New Year celebration was coming up. And when that happens, nothing moves. They said, your cargo is at the port. It's ready to load on a boat. But if we don't load it before the New Year celebration, it's not getting on a boat for like 2 weeks. It's a big deal. Everybody's shutting down. And so my point being, the Lunar New Year celebration, it's just like Christmas here in the United States or Europe. People travel, they spend a boatload of money they don't have. They max out their credit cards, they cash in their savings to buy gifts for all their friends and family members to do this expensive travel having gotten even more expensive, to have these parties and these big get-togethers. And so every year around the Lunar New Year, you would see a dip in price. The logic being people were selling Bitcoin because they had their Lunar New Year celebration coming up. And I hadn't heard any Lunar New Year FUD this year to explain why Bitcoin was going to crash in the end of January. But what Lunar New Year was, what was Lunar New Year? It was the 29th, right? And on the 28th or 29th, we had the first beginning of this most recent, this pullback. And this isn't even a big pullback. It's not a 29 or 30% pullback. What are you down, like 6% from the all-time high? So, but my point being, history continues to rhyme. And when I was looking at the chart of the previous halving cycle of 2017, and I'm looking at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 major pullbacks of greater than 30%. One of them was what was attributed to the Lunar New Year. And so the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? That's all I wanted to say. One of the ways this cycle is undeniably, absolutely different was, of course, governments getting into nation state FOMO. And we spoke a little bit last week about how it's not just nation state FOMO, it's state FOMO, and how the state FOMO could end up being even more significant than nation state FOMO, because they say, the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. So if you get 50 US states all trying to stack Bitcoin, that might even be a bigger race to buy Bitcoin, more pressure on the Bitcoin price than just the United States competing. And since last week, we have added a few new states that have introduced legislation into their state legislatures, their state governing bodies, to establish state-level strategic Bitcoin reserves. I think that we're up to 17 states now. Previously, we had Arizona, Texas, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, North Dakota, New Hampshire, Montana, South Dakota, Kentucky, Utah, Florida, Missouri, Wyoming. And then today it was announced that New Mexico has introduced legislation to establish a state Bitcoin reserve, becoming the 17th state. And if you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time at all, I've been in New Mexico a lot. I have ties to New Mexico, deep ties to New Mexico. New Mexico's state motto is the land of enchantment. And it is an enchanting state. The people, the history, because it's a heavily, it's not just a Hispanic heavily influenced state. It's a Pueblo culture, a Native American heavily influenced state. The Pueblo people influence the food. That way, when people think of the food in New Mexico, a lot of people just refer to it as Mexican food, but it's not. It's New Mexican food, and it's completely different than Mexican food just a couple of miles across the border in Arizona or in Colorado or in Texas, where they have Tex-Mex. The point being, New Mexico is an enchanting state. So their slogan is the land of enchantment. The landscaping is definitely enchanting, the high deserts and the mountains, but the locals refer to it as the land of entrapment, because if anything, New Mexico is notorious for government inefficiency and for government corruption. New Mexico, they're a left-leaning government in general, and they tend to look at California as a role model, where the rest of the country says, dear God, don't California my Florida. New Mexico, they want to be California one day. And so the fact that they're going to jump in and potentially establish a Bitcoin state reserve before the federal government even pulls this off is just astounding. If New Mexico's getting in on the action, if New Mexico's going to FOMO into Bitcoin, buckle up. Because, New Mexico, we like to call them the 48th state. And not because they were the 48th state admitted into the country, because they're stereotypically 48th in everything. 48th, as in not the best, as in second to last. 48th worst in education and poverty and crime, just the 48th state, 48 in everything. And now they're in they're number 17 potentially, in the top 17 of the 50 states when it comes to adopting Bitcoin. So that's really cool. They say Bitcoin changes you, fix the money, fix the world. Maybe fix New Mexico. I love New Mexico. It's beautiful. I'm an addict of the hatch green chili. New Mexican food is, you can't get it anywhere. Half the time I travel to New Mexico is because I need a hatch green chili cheeseburger fix. So pretty cool to see New Mexico getting on board the Bitcoin bandwagon potentially. So there had been a lot of fretting in the last week or so about the strategic Bitcoin reserve on a national level. If you remember that people were saying that Trump had promised a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and he didn't actually promise a strategic Bitcoin reserve. He said that he wanted to end the previous administration's war on crypto, he said, and end Elizabeth Warren's and Biden's war on crypto, and make sure that we weren't driving innovation out of the country, making sure that we were the leader in Bitcoin companies and Bitcoin adoption. And not to sell the Bitcoin that we had, but not necessarily promising to go full Bitcoin reserve. But nonetheless, that kind of morphed into an expectation. And then when they came out with the whole digital asset framework, people started thinking, oh, dear God, don't S-coin us. And then Brad Garlinghouse and the XRP scammers started just trying to muscle in, and people were really worried about XRP getting to dictate what happens with the Bitcoin reserve. And so people were really worried about that. And I mentioned, remember, Trump holds a grudge. Clearly that should be obvious to everybody watching the news by now. And XRP was very instrumental in donating and pushing Kamala Harris. They were loud and vocal about it. They were very anti-Trump. So I seriously doubt the people in Trump's orbit and Trump himself don't know that. And if they do know that, the chances of them letting someone who they would view as a backstabber and a traitor weasel their way in, I don't see it happening. But there was more cause for relief today when President Trump's crypto czar, David Sachs, had a press conference basically saying that they were going to evaluate a Bitcoin reserve. And he used the word Bitcoin reserve. He didn't say crypto reserve. He said Bitcoin again. So I guess we won't know. And even if the country does go down a basket crypto reserve or whatever, all that does is hurt the United States. Is it a blown opportunity for those of us that live here? Yes. Is it going to hurt Bitcoin and Bitcoin adoption? No, because the rest of the world is going to FOMO in, and eventually everybody that dilutes their strategic reserves with Ethereum or Solana or XRP, they're going to see those other investments go to zero against Bitcoin. And that is only going to serve to reinforce the message that it is Bitcoin only, and that it needs to be Bitcoin only, that it's Bitcoin and it's shitcoins. And maybe the United States needs to touch the stove. Only time will tell. Speaking of the change of this new cycle, I've mentioned many times that this was going to be the cycle that vindicates El Salvador. It was going to be the cycle that vindicates MicroStrategy, Michael Saylor, the early corporate and nation adopters of Bitcoin. But MicroStrategy wasn't alone in adding Bitcoin to their treasury last cycle. Remember, Elon mentioned something about Bitcoin, and Michael Saylor reached out to him, and Tesla ended up buying, they bought like 40 or 50,000 Bitcoin. So without getting into the Tesla drama, because there was certainly a lot of Tesla drama last cycle. First Elon aped into Bitcoin, and then he backed off because the left went absolutely crazy. And so I'm not going to get into all that and rehash it. The point being, Tesla ultimately sold about 3/4 of their Bitcoin, but they still hold just under 10,000 Bitcoin. I think it's 9,720 Bitcoin that Tesla still holds. Well, Business Insider reported just the other day with the headline, Bitcoin boosts Tesla profits by almost $600 million after accounting rule change. Remember, we talked about the new Financial Accounting Standards Board's generally accepted accounting practices rule change, where previous to now, companies had to write down their Bitcoin. If they held Bitcoin and the price dropped, they had to mark it as a loss. But when the price went back up, they couldn't change that. So if you bought Bitcoin at $1,000 and Bitcoin went down to $1, and you had to mark that Bitcoin holding down to where if it was only worth like $1 a Bitcoin, and then even if Bitcoin went all the way up to $100,000 or whatever it's at in the future, you couldn't mark it back up. You still had to carry it on your books like it was a loss, like your Bitcoin was only worth $1 when they were worth vastly more than that. So the article goes on to explain this. Bitcoin made up a chunk of Tesla's profits last quarter due to an accounting rule change that allowed the automaker to report its unrealized gains on the cryptocurrency as income in its latest earnings report. Elon Musk's electric vehicle company recorded $589 million in paper gains on the crypto as profit. boosting its net income by 34% to $2.3 billion. The article goes on to say a little bit of fluff and then continues. The Financial Accounting Standards Board recently changed its policy to allow companies to mark their digital assets to market each quarter. Previously, they had to report their holdings at the lowest value those assets had ever reached under their ownership. So we knew this was going to be big, these FASB GAAP rule changes, and we're already seeing that. And the other thing to note is that $600 million crypto gain that that Bitcoin made for Tesla, despite the fact they sold 75% of their Bitcoin, they quote unquote took profits on 75% of their Bitcoin. They currently hold more Bitcoin in fiat value than they did when they first bought Bitcoin, even though they dumped 75% of it. So a solid lesson for Elon Musk and Tesla, and one that other companies are watching. Speaking of other companies, speaking of the Michael Saylor MicroStrategy playbook, Michael Saylor announced a big change today. He teased it early this morning where he said big strategy day with Bitcoin symbol for the B in big. He followed that up about 6 hours later with a tweet press release. MicroStrategy is now strategy. So dropping the micro and just going with strategy, but the new logo includes the Bitcoin logo. So it's strategy with a Bitcoin B kind of attached to the top of the Y, like a superscript. So that's cool. MicroStrategy saying MicroStrategy is now strategy. And the reason they did so is because they're now focusing on being a Bitcoin treasury company and kind of writing off their software business. There's some other news that came out in the financial release, like basically their existing business is dwindling. They actually lost, I think, like $48 million last quarter or last year. Whatever they were reporting, they were losing money on their existing software business now. So bold move, paying off for Michael Saylor and MicroStrategy, rebranding the company to reflect that, and people are watching. Another fun piece of news that came out yesterday was the United States has really been engaging with El Salvador quite a bit. Marco Rubio, as soon as he was confirmed as Secretary of State, flew down to El Salvador to meet with Nayib Bukele, and he tweeted out yesterday, while in El Salvador, I signed a memorandum of understanding on strategic civil nuclear cooperation with Foreign Minister it's a Twitter handle. This cooperative MOU strengthens the U.S.-El Salvador bilateral relationship and helps promote mutual economic prosperity. So interesting, something I didn't have on my bingo card, the United States entering into an agreement to help El Salvador with civil nuclear power generation. Wouldn't that be cool? I mean, I know we're already excited about volcano power, hydropower, volcano-powered Bitcoin mining, but there's a lot of energy in a volcano. But the way we tap volcano power is, it's kind of like how we harness the energy from the sun. If you stood in the blast of solar wind, you would just be incinerated. But the amount of electricity that we harness from that in solar panels after it works its way through the atmosphere and soaks into a silicon wafer is very, very little, just a minute fraction of the power of the sun. And in the same way, harnessing geothermal involves basically pumping water into the ground, letting the lava heat it, the earth heat it, and creating steam that spins a turbine. So very old-fashioned volcano-powered steam engine, basically. Nothing compared to the energy potential from splitting atoms. And so imagine how much better of a country El Salvador will be with much more clean, reliable electricity. And then imagine El Salvador being the first country to go nuclear Bitcoin mining, potentially. Just a tangent. They don't say anything about mining Bitcoin with that power, but really cool to see El Salvador becoming a better place for the people to live, regardless of whether it's in terms of, Bitcoin improving their lives financially, or the infrastructure, which, directly relates to the improvements that, if it hadn't been for the Bitcoin and Nayib Bukele turning that country completely around, none of these investments would be on the table, let alone even dreamt about. So really cool. Congratulations to the people of El Salvador. Congratulations to President Bukele on your budding, blossoming relationship with the current U.S. government. All right, on to what makes today special, and that is today is DCA Wednesday. Every Wednesday is DCA Wednesday. What is DCA, you might ask? Well, DCA is short for dollar cost averaging. And dollar cost averaging, not investment advice, is an investment strategy where you invest your money in equal portions at regular intervals, regardless of price. Kind of a set it and forget it thing. So, for example, we chose an equal portion of just 20 US dollars. Again, $20 might be a lot of money for you, but for others, it might be a completely insignificant sum. The point being, you pick a number that you're comfortable with investing on a regular basis, and then you just invest it every time that that interval comes around, whether it's weekly, daily, bi-weekly, whatever. Most people get paid every week, and so most people that DCA into any investment DCA on their payday. So if you want to invest every Friday or whenever you get paid, again, that's a you do you thing. The point being, you pick, you set the strategy, lay it down in stone. You pick an amount that you're going to put into Bitcoin, and you do so every week or every month or every day or whenever that interval comes around. The theory being, time in the markets beats timing the markets every time it's tried. Now, we've been doing this. We've done this 184 Wednesdays. We started all the way back on Wednesday, July 28th in 2021. So this is going to be our 185th Wednesday. We've stacked 20 US dollars every single one of those. We've converted 3,680 US dollars in those 184 Wednesdays into a stack of more than 10 million Satoshis. That's more than 0.1 Bitcoin. And that just goes to show, for people who think they're too late, that they can't afford to buy Bitcoin because, what do I have, $20? How much Bitcoin is that going to buy? Well, if you'd been stacking that $20 with us every Wednesday, that'd buy you 0.1 Bitcoin already. More than 0.1, for example. In fact, 10,350,727 sats to be precise. Now, we did so at an average cost basis of $35,553.06, which is significantly cheaper than the current price of Bitcoin, and it's even cheaper than that first DCA Wednesday when we purchased at almost 40,000 US dollars per Bitcoin. The point being, we bought all the way up to the all-time high in 2021, then we bought all the way down to the cycle low of in the teens, and now we bought all the way back up. So we bought the highs, we bought the lows, we bought everywhere in between, but we bought at an average price that's pretty darn good of just $35,553, as opposed to trying to time the market, gambling, YOLOing in, and buying at a high and then getting discouraged. Or even buying at a good price 4 years ago. If you'd bought at $40,000, we've still done better than that. And I would say at some point in time, our cost basis is going to go higher than $40,000, because when we're stacking at $1 million of Bitcoin or 2 million of Bitcoin, it's obviously going to increase our average purchase price dramatically. But if $20 is a lot of money to you, you can't say, well, if you'd stacked all 3,680 back July, you'd bought at an average price of $39,000. Well, if you can only afford $20 a week, coming up with $3,600 is moot. So more than likely, let's say you came up with $500 and aped in, and then 6 months or a year later you came up with another 500. You would be way behind where we are in your average cost basis. So I think we've solidly proven the concept of dollar cost averaging, and hopefully you've been following along and you've seen those results for yourself. We, of course, are going to add to that stack today. And as always, I'm going to add to that stack with the Cash App. At the meetup yesterday, one of the things I discussed was that it doesn't really matter where you buy your Bitcoin as long as you get it immediately off the exchange. This is a you do you thing. For example, Cash App charges a higher fee than, say, Coinbase does. But we're only buying $20 of the Bitcoin. So the fact we're going to pay maybe 10 cents more to buy the Bitcoin than I did if I bought it with Cash App, well, I mean, then I've bought it with Coinbase. Forgive my slip there. When we transfer that Bitcoin out of our hardware wallet, Cash App's not going to charge us a mining fee. They're going to let us do it for free. Whereas when I transfer Bitcoin from Coinbase, I pay a mining fee, which they don't let me set. And the last time I helped a family member transfer their Bitcoin out of Coinbase, they charged them a $5 mining fee to move like $1,000 of the Bitcoin. So the fact that we're not going to pay that mining fee, to me, makes it worth it to pay a little bit more of a fee. There's some other benefits and some other reasons I use Cash App. They are not a sponsor of the show. I am not promoting Cash App. What I said is this is a you do you thing. All that matters is buy from a reputable company. Don't pick something company you just heard about on Reddit. The big ones like Coinbase, Cash App, Strike, Robinhood, Gemini, something that's an old established company that's probably not going to screw you over. And as long as you transfer your Bitcoin immediately to your self-custody, If they go belly up, they're not rugging you because they don't have your Bitcoin. It doesn't matter. If you bought it and took it home, it's like if you go to the grocery store and you buy a dozen eggs and you leave them there until you need them and the grocery store goes out of business, you're out of your eggs. But if you go to the grocery store, buy your eggs and go home, other than the fact you might be sad if your local Aldi goes out of business, it doesn't steal your Bitcoin. It doesn't steal your eggs. So it doesn't really matter where you buy your Bitcoin. Do your own research. Find a source to purchase your Bitcoin that you think fits those needs, that are tailored to your needs or that you like, or maybe use a variety. I have used a variety. For this podcast, I like Cash App. And so we're going to use Cash App. So it's just a matter of open up my phone, opening up Cash App, tapping the Bitcoin tab, tap and buy, entering $20. I already have $20 in Cash App, but one of the other reasons I love Cash App is that I don't have to. They will let me add $20 immediately, spend it immediately, and transfer the Bitcoin out immediately. All things that most other exchanges won't let you do. They'll either won't let you purchase the Bitcoin until those funds have settled, or they'll let you purchase the Bitcoin, but they won't let you take it into your own self-custody until those funds have settled. So like Cash App will let me buy or Coinbase will let me buy Bitcoin now, but I can't withdraw it for like a week to make sure my money really, really, really gets there. So again, you do you. I'm using Cash App. So tap and buy, enter in $20, tap and confirm, and voila, kaboom. Just like that, we have added another 20,136 sats. That warms my heart that it is more than 20,000 sats because, last week we only added 18,757 sats for the same $20. The 2 weeks before that were in the $19,000 range. So while a lot of people are lamenting that the price of Bitcoin it's gone up while I was talking. I bought at a purchase price of $97,092. So a couple $100 more than when I started this podcast. So maybe it's on its way back up. Maybe it just went up a little bit just for me because it knew I was getting ready to buy. Just kidding. But the point being, we got more than 1,000 sats per dollar, and that is cool. And so that is why I am not crying in my tea that Bitcoin's worth less than 100,000 US dollars at the moment, because I want to stack as many sats as possible, because even though I have more than most people I know, I don't have enough. I have enough that I'll be comfortable if we end up, I will survive if we end up on Bitcoin Standard. But do I have generational wealth levels of Bitcoin? Maybe. I guess that depends where the price of Bitcoin ends up before I leave this world. But I don't have the amount of Bitcoin that I am aiming to stack. So the lower the US dollar value of Bitcoin, the more likely it is for me to achieve my goal. If you're new to stacking Bitcoin, the more likely it is that you're going to achieve that goal that you've set for yourself. Either way, though, that brings our stack up to 10,370,863 Satoshis. It does bump up that average cost basis a little bit by another $123 or $24 to about $35,676 per Bitcoin. Still not too shabby, considering that's less than half, almost a third of what the current US dollar price of Bitcoin is. Perhaps more importantly, for those of us who are still living in the fiat matrix, that still tend to value your net worth, value your wealth in your unit of account, your unit of reference, if you're still using the US dollar and not the Satoshi, as most people are, your current stack, when not if, but when, I used to always say when Bitcoin hits $100,000, our stack will be worth blah. So I guess when Bitcoin goes back to $100,000, $3,000 from now, that stack would have a US dollar value of $10,370.86. But when Bitcoin hits 1 million US dollars, maybe that'll happen this cycle. Maybe it'll happen in 2029 after the 2028 halving. Maybe it doesn't happen until after the 2032 halving, but eventually it will happen. The longer it takes, the more Bitcoin we're going to be able to stack for that fiat. But when it does, our current stack, without adding a single extra Satoshi, would have a fiat value of $103,708.63. That is pretty incredible, considering that we've only converted 3,700 US dollars into Bitcoin. When Bitcoin 10x's from there, which I firmly believe it will do in our lifetime, that stack will be worth more than 1 million US dollars. And when we get to that pie in the sky number that Fidelity's director of global macro, Jurian Timmer, said back in 2022 when he forecast that Bitcoin will be worth $1 billion by the year 2038, a number that's certainly possible, maybe sooner than later if we get into nation state FOMO and we move towards that, the global reserve currency status faster than many have thought. Then when it does, when Bitcoin eventually hits 1 billion a coin, and that stack would be worth $103,708,630 Those will be the kind of gains that you read the stories about. That teenager that took his $1,000 that he got from his grandma for his birthday or for his bar mitzvah and converted it into Bitcoin, and now that $1,000 is worth $100 million. Those are the wow. Could you only imagine if we'd gotten in just 10 years ago? We'd be millionaires, 100 millionaires, billionaires by now. Just the amount of Bitcoin that we've stacked for just $3,700 now will be worth over $100 million if that happens. And that is pretty cool. If that happens, I guess, then I'd be more than comfortable with the size of my Bitcoin stack. But I guess only time will tell, because as I said, I don't have a crystal ball and nobody else does. But I do believe that eventually Bitcoin will continue. Well, it eventually will get there, because zooming out, regardless of how long it takes, Bitcoin will continue to go up and to the right as Bitcoin eats fiat. The way that email destroyed regular mail. People don't send, handwritten letters anymore, except for maybe over the holidays. And even then it's probably a typed letter with a photoshopped picture into it. But the way that the automobile got rid of the horse and buggy, the way that, airplanes got rid of crossing the Atlantic in old wooden ships, Bitcoin's going to do the same thing to fiat, the same thing to the banking system. And when it does, the price of Bitcoin in fiat terms, well, eventually there will be no fiat price because we'll be on a Bitcoin standard. But until that time, until the last government is forced to give up their fiat, kicking and screaming, there will be a fiat value. And when that fiat value is the equivalent to $1 billion, you'll be set. And that's really cool. As usual, before I wrap up, I want to take a minute to ask you to help support this podcast by feeding that algorithm monster. If you share this episode, if you rate or review this episode of this podcast, that goes miles towards helping other people see this podcast. Everything is algorithm driven. Almost nobody is going to find this podcast because there's so many out there that if they just search for Bitcoin, the chances of this podcast popping up are very slim. But those statistics increase every time anyone interacts with that algorithm monster. So by sharing this podcast, liking this podcast, making sure you have automatic downloads disabled and enabled if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, all those things can help someone else, someone new, discover this podcast and maybe become orange pilled, maybe learn that they don't have to buy a whole Bitcoin, that they can purchase just $20 a week and still build an appreciable stack of Bitcoin. So that would mean a lot to me, and maybe you'll help make the world a better place just by feeding that algorithm monster. You can also feed that algorithm monster and find out about things going on in the Bitcoin community, especially right here on the Space Coast, by making sure you're following us on Twitter/X. And again, on Twitter X, we are at BTC Bulletin Pod, BTC Bulletin Pod, like Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. All right, that's going to wrap it up for this week. Hopefully you have a fantastic weekend, and we will see you again on next Wednesday while we grow that stack of Satoshis together. But either way, don't forget to keep on stacking those sats, you sexy sat stackers.